public input meeting here on the June 10th. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, Regional Council is practicing physical distancing, and all of the councillors are participating electronically, except for myself. I'm here in the chamber. The purpose of this meeting is to receive comments in regards to the Regional Official Plan Review. Delegations will be heard today, but no decisions will be made. The report before you is for information purposes only. And now I would like to ask Jessica Rudy to perform the roll call.
Councillor Armstrong?
Present.
Councillor Erb?
Present.
Councillor Foxton?
Present.
Councillor Galloway?
Present.
Councillor Harris?
Present.
Councillor Jaworski?
Here.
Councillor Jowett?
Here.
Councillor Kiefer?
Here.
Councillor Lorentz? Councillor Mann? Councillor Nowak?
Present.
Chair Redmond?
Present.
Councillor Shantz?
Present.
Councillor Strickland? Councillor Vervanovich?
Present.
And Councillor Clark sent her regrets. I'll just call on Councillor Lorentz, Councillor Mann, and Councillor Strickland. Those three are absent tonight.
Thank you, Jessica. And Councillor Clark is at an HPAC meeting that's concurrent with the meeting tonight. So we're here to deal with the updated official plan review. We'll have a presentation first from staff and consultants, and then we will go to the delegations, and we currently have 8 or 9 of those. So I'll turn it over to John Lubcyznski for the presentation, along with Jamie Cook. John is with our staff, and Jamie is with Watson and Associates Economists, who are consulting with us, along with Dillon Consulting. John?
So Councillor Galloway, if it's okay, I'm going to sort of do a brief introduction and then pass it over to John.
Okay, Michelle.
Okay. So first of all, I wanted to start off by thanking council and staff for facilitating this additional committee meeting. We do truly appreciate it. Tonight, we're starting the discussion on how and where the region is going to be growing. Waterloo region is one of the fastest growing regions in Canada, and we're planning growth out to 2051. Quite honestly, it's a lot of people, and it's a lot of employment, and it's a fairly long period of time. Now, we do have a new land needs methodology that we need to consider, and that provides for us to consider and reflect on market demand. But we also have to consider some of the region's strategic objectives when we consider growth, including climate action and moving us towards a net zero community, thriving economy, and continuing to be that western anchor of the technology corridor, and trying to achieve that vision for the east side lands that we have. We want to think about sustainable transportation, providing support for stage 2 ION, GO service to the region, and transit supportive densities in our greenfield areas. We're looking to try to achieve more affordable housing and attainable housing, as well as considering financial stability and considering sort of the way we provide services, making sure that it's efficient and cost effective. We also want to grow in a way that's going to be inclusive and provides for equity. And while the ROC can't meet all of the objectives on its own, it's really a formative document that's going to set the stage to help us achieve these objectives. And it's with this in mind that we're going to be talking about potential growth scenarios and how we plan to evaluate them. At this point, I'm going to introduce you to a couple of key staff and our consultants. So we've got Brenna McKinnon, who is the manager of policy, who's responsible overall for the ROC review. We've got John Lubcyznski, who will be presenting tonight. He's one of our principal planners. We have Jamie Cook from Watson, as well as Patty Kennedy from Dillon, who are all here to help with the presentation and answer questions. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to John. So John, go ahead.
Thank you, Michelle. Good evening, Mr. Chairman and committee members. This is John Lubcyznski. I'm a planner here at the Region of Waterloo, and I'm also part of the Regional Official Plan ROC review team. Our presentation tonight is structured around 6 themes, and if we could ask Brenna to put the presentation on.
It's actually Tim who's going to do it. So
okay.
John, you are quite loud and a little bit hard to understand as a result. So maybe, if you want to sit back or something from the from your microphone.
Or call in on the audio.
Is that better?
I would try calling in instead of using the Wi-Fi connection, but
It's not as loud, but it's still a little bit garbled, John.
Okay. Would you like me to try calling in instead then?
Yeah, it might be best if you call in.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Just need the presentation.
I'm gonna go sit at your seat.
So, John, if you're in Michelle's office now, Michelle was fine when she was speaking.
Okay.
So
Is that, can you hear me now?
that's better, much better, yeah.
Okay, sorry about the technical glitch. Hopefully you can hear me okay now.
Now you're a bit faint.
Okay, I'll speak up. I'm just waiting for the presentation to come up. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, I think we're good now. Okay, so let's start again. So our presentation tonight is divided into 6 main sections. First, I'd like to start off by giving some brief policy context, and I'll also briefly go over the region's growth forecast to 2051. After that, I'll introduce staff's preliminary growth scenarios, which we're seeking feedback on from the public tonight. After that, I'd like to turn the presentation over to our land consultant, economist, Jamie Cook, and he'll provide an overview of the provincial land needs assessment methodology that we're following as part of the ROP review. Jamie will also present the initial results of our growth scenarios, and he'll get a little bit, have a closer look at the numbers. And after that, I'll briefly review the requests for urban expansions that we've received to date. And then I'll conclude by providing a brief overview of the evaluation criteria that we'll be following to assess the various growth scenarios, as well as any required urban expansions. Next slide, please. So the province of Ontario provides policy direction to the region for growth management planning through a number of provincial plans, policies, including the growth plan for the Greater Golden Horseshoe. And among other things, the growth plan directs the region to plan for long-term population and employment growth for 2051. Next slide. Next slide, please. So this table highlights the region's population and employment growth forecast to 2051 as taken from the provincial growth plan. And as you can see from the slide, the region's population is anticipated to climb to about 923,000 people by the year 2051. And this represents an increase of about 54% over our current population levels. On the employment side, the region is forecast at about 178,000 additional jobs, and this represents an increase of about 61% over our current levels. So the key takeaway here is that the region is anticipating significant growth over the next 30 years, and it's important that we start planning for it today. Next slide, please. So in very general terms, the region is planning to accommodate its forecasted growth in 2 broad ways. First, a significant amount of our growth would be directed to our existing built-up areas through intensification. And most of this growth would be focused along the new ION rapid transit corridor, the associated major transit station areas, and other strategic growth areas that are linked to the transit system. And these key intensification areas are generally located in the yellow areas as shown on the slide before you. The balance of the region's growth would be directed to the region's existing greenfield communities, and if necessary, to newly designated greenfield areas through an urban expansion. And the region's current designated greenfield areas are generally located in the light colored purple areas that you see on this slide. Next slide, please. So this brings us to our preliminary growth scenarios, and to estimate how much land the region would require to accommodate its forecasted growth. Staff have identified a base case and 3 additional growth scenarios as shown on this slide. And each scenario would test progressively denser development assumptions to see the overall effect on the region's land needs in the future. And so the 2 key variables in this analysis include the intensification target and the density target for designated greenfield areas, or DGAs. The base case scenario would include an intensification target of 50% and a DGA density target of 60 people and jobs per hectare. In general, the base case scenario reflects what the regional housing market has been delivering on average over the past few years. Scenario 1 would increase the intensification target to 55%, but maintain the DGA density target at 60 people and jobs per hectare. And in scenario 2, we would increase the intensification target to 60%, but maintain the DGA density target at 60 people and jobs per hectare. And then finally, in scenario 3, which is our most ambitious scenario, we would keep the intensification target at 60%, but then increase the DGA density target to 65 people and jobs per hectare. Each scenario would estimate the amount of land required both for community area growth plus employment area growth. And then once we calculate those gross land requirements for the 2 areas, we'd review each scenario against our available land supply, our planned regional structure, as well as a series of evaluation criteria that I'll be explaining or talking about in a few minutes. So this analysis will culminate in a preferred growth scenario, which would ultimately guide how and where the region would grow over the next 30 years. So based on the initial results of our growth scenarios, the region may need to expand its urban boundaries to accommodate some of its forecasted growth, particularly on the employment side. And as set out in the current regional official plan, any required urban expansions must be considered on lands located between the existing urban area boundary and the countryside line. And these candidate urban expansion areas are generally shown in the yellow areas on the slide before you. In addition, where the countryside line coincides with the protected countryside designation in the ROP, the countryside line is to be considered a permanent boundary. Mr. Chairman, at this stage, I'd like to turn the presentation over to our consultant land economist, Jamie Cook.
Okay, thanks, John.
Great. Thanks, John. Good evening, everybody. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can, Jamie.
I'm getting a little bit of feedback on my end, but maybe I'll just turn my volume down just a tiny bit. I can do that. Okay. So just building on John's first few slides, I want to get into a bit more detail on the land needs assessment results from the various scenarios that we've been testing to date. Before we get into that, I just want to provide a little bit of background on the approach to the land needs assessment methodology. So back in 2018, the province released a revised land needs assessment methodology guideline. This methodology essentially lays out how municipalities across the Greater Golden Horseshoe are to undertake land needs assessments within their comprehensive reviews, municipal reviews, and official plan reviews. It builds on the work that was previously provided in the 2017 land needs methodology, but it ultimately looks to provide a more outcome-based and simplified approach, ultimately in determining and describing how these assessments are to be taken or carried out. I also just want to just emphasize that while there is quite a bit of detail in the LNA methodology, the focus is really oriented towards the urban system within municipalities, in this case in the region of Waterloo. So while we are also required to look at the rural system and rural lands, we're not looking at this within the same prescriptive sort of lens as the LNA sets out for urban lands. Next slide. So when we look at the LNA and how it breaks down or categorizes urban lands, what it does is it breaks down lands into two categories, one being what it calls community lands, and the other being employment areas or employment lands. So community areas are largely where people live. It accounts for all the residential lands within an urban area, as well as any population-related employment like retail, institutional uses like schools and churches, as well as any work-at-home employment. Those are all accommodated within the community area land category. And then employment areas are essentially largely where people work, and includes all employment in industrial type buildings, but it would also include some additional office and other institutional type uses, as well as any ancillary retail uses that would generally support the overall function of an employment area or an industrial area. So we're required to break down our assessment to these two broad urban categories that I'll be speaking to as we work through the next few slides. Next slide. So I wanted to just provide a little bit of a background on housing. We're not going to get into all the details on the population projections. John has provided an overview of the overall growth that we're trying to accommodate. So one of the key requirements of this LNA and the Municipal Comprehensive Review is to understand, when we're looking at the community areas, how many households are we going to be required to accommodate to ultimately accommodate that forecast that we're looking to achieve by 2051. So when we look at the 2021 base, you can see that within the region of Waterloo, a large share of the housing is dominated in what we would call grade-related housing types. So that's low density and medium density. And that represents about 74% in total of the total housing stock currently as of 2021. Now, we are using Statistics Canada definitions for housing by type. When we look at the official plan, there are some adjustments that we'll be making to ensure that we're accommodating housing by type in accordance with how the official plan defines and categorizes housing. But just as we start off, just to explain how we're defining it in this case of the initial LNA, low density is essentially single and semi-detached dwellings. Medium density is townhomes and apartments and duplexes, and high density is all apartments, low-rise, mid-rise, and high-rise apartments. Secondary units are also typically included in our high-density category in terms of their occupancy. So they typically have a lower occupancy like an apartment, but they're grade-related. So when we look at their overall need and their categorization in the land needs analysis, they ultimately get identified as a part of the grade-related component of the housing supply and housing stock. Next slide. So this slide here provides a summary of the housing forecast by structure type based on the structure types that I just defined in the last slide. And you can see here over the last 15 years from 2006 to 2021, on the left-hand side of this graph, the mix of housing has steadily shifted from grade-related housing forms, so being low density, medium density, to more high density housing forms. And that's particularly been accelerated in the last 10 years, as you can see here in the graph. Moving forward, we would expect to see this shift continue over time. We would expect to see a gradual shift in the share of high density housing overall within the region, and a gradual decline in the share of housing in low density forms, and a fairly steady supply of demand, I should say, of medium density housing. Now, one thing I do want to point out is that when you're looking at this graph, it doesn't necessarily show you the magnitude of housing that we're expecting to accommodate. When we compare the historical rate of housing to the forecast rate in this graph, The overall increase in growth is about 36%. So we're expecting to see quite a bit of an increase in the overall amount of housing required to achieve that 2051 population. So it's important to recognize that when we're looking at the absolute amount of housing. Some of the key factors that we think are going to be driving the shift in housing demand by structure type are an increasing share of seniors or 65 plus population and their demand for a wider variety of housing by type and tenure. The region also has a large component of non-permanent residents. So this is largely students who are international, as well as international workers who are coming to the region, particularly in skilled trades. We're also, as you know, experiencing upward pressure on housing prices, which is putting pressure on housing affordability. And so all these factors combined have steadily influenced the shift in housing mix over time, and we would experience that trend to continue over the longer term. Next slide. When we look at the overall mix of housing by 2051, based on our scenario 1, when you add in the existing stock, plus add the growth from 21 to 51, we're expecting the overall low density share to drop from about 59% to 46%. Medium density is expected to increase slightly to 18%, and high density is expected to increase by about 10% of the overall share of housing. Next slide. So we're going to turn it over to the employment forecast for a few slides. As John mentioned, the region's required to accommodate 470,000 jobs by 2051. That represents an increase of about 178,000 jobs between 2019 and 2051, which was the basis of our forecast employment data. That represents an increase of about 60% in the overall employment base between 2019 and 51. So it's a significant amount of employment. And when we look at that breakdown of employment by type or category, the province identifies through the LNA methodology 4 different categories of employment that we're required to look at over the forecast period. And those categories are 1, employment land employment. So employment land employment is essentially the employment areas and the jobs that are accommodated in industrial type buildings. Major office employment is the second category, accounting for about 24% of the overall forecast. This represents standalone office buildings that are 20,000 square feet or greater. Most of the office would be accommodated in downtown areas as well as major transit station areas, but some of this growth would also be accommodated in employment areas where appropriate. The other category here is population-related employment. So this is largely your retail, population serving employment, institutional employment that generally would follow population growth. It's projected to increase by about 83,000 jobs, which represents about 47% of the overall forecast. And then lastly, we're projecting a net increase of about 1,000 jobs in the rural area. So when we take those total jobs and we break those down into or allocate them to community areas and employment areas. When we're looking at the employment areas off to the right, you can see that ultimately generates an increase of about just under 71,000 jobs in employment areas, or about 40% of the overall employment forecast. So essentially, of the total jobs, 40% of the jobs are anticipated to be accommodated in employment areas. 60% are anticipated to be accommodated in community areas. The employment area jobs, as you can see in the slide here, are broken down between largely ELE employment, which is mostly industrial type buildings, major office, and PRE. So it's about 2/3 industrial type buildings, 1/3 PRE and MOE, office and retail institutional. Next slide. So based on this analysis, when we're looking at the employment area land need, there's 2 sort of essential steps we have to look at. One is, how much of the growth is going to be accommodated in employment areas, which we've identified as just under 71,000 jobs. And ultimately, then what is the density of that employment that we're accommodating? So through our analysis, looking at existing trends in density and anticipated trends that are going to influence densities going forward, we've identified an overall density of about 35 jobs per hectare. So that's a little bit higher than what the densities are now. In current employment areas, you're averaging around 32 jobs per hectare. We don't see a lot of upward influence on the densities over time. Densities generally have been trending downward because of the demand we're seeing for land-extensive uses, largely related to the logistics sector. We're also seeing increased automation in the manufacturing sector, and while that sector has been rebounding slightly over the last 5 or so years, it's not expected to generate as significant as amount of employment due to automation. We are some upward trends in densities associated with more non-industrial type uses in employment areas, like multi-tenant office and some other major office types, as well as some employment supportive uses. It's not really enough to offset that declining trend that we're experiencing. We also looked at the amount of intensification that would be reasonable in employment areas. So some employment areas are still underutilized and have the potential to see more employment within them through further expansion of existing operations. So through that analysis, we've identified an intensification target of 15%. So when we compare on the right here, the demand versus the supply of employment land, you can see taking 71,000 jobs divided by 35 gives us 1,735 hectares of demand. When we compare that against the supply is just over 1,000 hectares. That gives us an overall deficit of 685 hectares. So this is the total amount of urban employment land that we would need to accommodate within future employment areas that aren't designated today. So through urban expansion, we would need to accommodate another 685 hectares of employment land under this analysis. A couple other things just to mention is, one, we're not expecting to see major changes in the employment land needs analysis based on the various sectors that we've provided. Each of the sectors generates the same amount of population, generating the same amount of population-related employment. But more importantly, the export-based type employment or the industrial type employment that we're expecting to see doesn't necessarily really vary that much between each of the scenarios that we've tested. We've looked at the opportunities for industrial or export-based type employment. There are certain areas where in the region where those types of employment will be more marketable and anticipated to be largely accommodated. It doesn't really vary significantly from one scenario to the next. So each of the scenarios generates the same amount of land in each case at 685 hectares. One last thing I would just mention is that the region has been refining the overall inventory of employment area based on a requirement to designate employment areas in this official plan update. And through that designation process, it has resulted in some additional employment areas being included in the supply, which will have some minor downward adjustment on our overall need moving forward. So this slide provides a summary overall urban land requirement associated with each of the scenarios from the base case to scenarios 1 to 3. There's a lot of figures on this table. I just really wanted to focus on the right column of this table, which identifies the total land requirement. I'm going to start with the employment land need again at 684.85 hectares. That remains consistent amongst each scenario. When we look at the column to the left, that's the region-wide need for community area land. And you can see there's a varying amount of land that's required from each of these scenarios. So as John mentioned in his opening slides, each scenario looks at a progressively higher amount of intensification and greenfield density. Starting off, the base case assumes a 50% intensification requirement and a 60 people in job per hectare target for density. So just to provide some context, when we look at the intensification, which is not necessarily a direct focus of the LNA for the community area, but it obviously has an impact because the more growth we put into the built-up area, the more pressure that takes away from future urban expansion. Looking at historical trends over the last 15 years or so, we have noticed that the amount of intensification has been increasing fairly steadily over that time period. And the region's already essentially achieving that 50% target, or has been in the recent decade. Going forward, we'd expect to see that potential for intensification to increase based on the mix of housing that we're looking to accommodate over time, as I've mentioned. And also given the significant infrastructure investment that the region's been making in higher order transit, for example, we would expect to see stronger demand in the future for both high density development in the built up area, but also for gentle intensification opportunities in the more medium density categories of housing over the long term. With respect to the DGA, or the designated greenfield area density target, the region's actually already achieving a density of 54 people and jobs per hectare within its existing community areas. And it's achieving that through about 96% grade related housing. So only about 4% of that housing is in high density categories. So it's reasonable to assume that over time, as we shift to see a greater share of housing in medium and high density, that overall density in the DGA, the designated greenfield area, will increase over time. And that's the rationalization essentially for looking at that base case of 50% intensification and 60 people and jobs per hectare. That base case generates an overall land requirement of community land of about 828 gross hectares of land. Looking at scenario one, assuming a higher amount of intensification, but the same overall target for people and jobs per hectare at 60, the overall requirement for residential land would drop to about 519 hectares. Under scenario two, assuming a 60% intensification target and 60 people and jobs per hectare, the land requirement for community areas would drop to 227 additional hectares. And then ultimately in scenario three, if we look at a 60% intensification target and 65 people and jobs per hectare, the overall output there is a surplus of community area lands of about 152 hectares. So when we combine community area and employment area, that generates a need from anywhere from just over 1,500 hectares to just over 500 hectares of land that would be required under each of these scenarios. Next slide. So wanted to just also provide a summary of what this looks like in terms of incremental growth from 2019 to 2051 with respect to the community areas. And so I already provided some background on the existing densities at 54 people and jobs per hectare as of 2019, with 96% being grade related. You can see here what would be required to achieve a density of 60 people and jobs per hectare on an incremental basis, and then ultimately 65. It's important to keep in mind that density includes both what's existing today and what's planned for to the 51 planning horizon. So it's all densities within your greenfield areas. So under the base case to scenario two, we would experience an increase from 54 jobs per hectare, people and jobs per hectare to 62 people and jobs per hectare. And again, these jobs are only the population related and associated jobs within community areas, including major office employment, as well as work at home, but not including the employment area jobs. And under the scenario three at 65 people and jobs per hectare, the overall incremental density would have to increase from 54 to 71. So based on the analysis that we've undertaken to date, looking at existing trends, as well as reviewing the applications that are currently active in planning approvals within greenfield areas, as well as looking at those medium and longer term demographic and socioeconomic trends that are affecting the types of housing that we would expect to be providing over the long term, we feel that these scenarios are a reasonable range of scenarios to be looking at that balance both market driven demands as well as the ultimate policy objectives of the growth plan and the regional official plan moving forward. So overall, again, the community area land component results in a deficit of just over 800 hectares under the base case scenario to a surplus of just over 150 hectares under scenario three. So I'm going to turn it back over to John, who's going to follow up with an overview of the growth scenario evaluation process.
Next slide, please. Thanks, Jamie. Mr. Chairman, now I'd like to provide a brief summary of the requests for urban expansions that we've received to date. And these requests have come from individual landowners, private land development companies, as well as some of our local area municipalities. And as you can see from the slide, we've received a total of 55 requests covering roughly 1,666 hectares of land. And of that total, 40 of the requests seek to expand either an urban area or a township urban area boundary, covering roughly 1,500 hectares of land. We've also received 13 requests related to a rural settlement area or a rural employment area in one of our 4 townships, and that would affect approximately 95 hectares of land. And we've also received 2 requests for urban development in the countryside, and that would affect about 66 hectares of land. Next slide, please. So this slide summarizes our proposed criteria for evaluating the urban expansion requests we've received, the growth scenarios I described earlier, plus any required urban expansion areas. And our evaluation criteria focus on 6 broad themes, including growth management, transportation infrastructure and financing, agricultural and mineral aggregate resources, natural environment and source water protection, livability, and finally, economic growth. Each of these themes includes a set of criteria or questions to provide for a broad comparison among the different scenarios. And these criteria are outlined in more detail in our staff report for tonight's public meeting. It's also important to note that our evaluation criteria would be viewed through a climate change lens to help identify scenarios that would reduce greenhouse gas emissions and help transition Waterloo region into a low energy, low carbon community over the next 30 years. The preferred growth scenario would also be informed by Regional Council's strategic focus, as well as the 5 key supporting background studies listed on this slide. Our draft employment land strategy and financial impact analysis will be released to the public in the coming weeks. And the remaining slides shown on the slide, the studies shown on the slide have already been, have either been completed or will be completed over the next few weeks. Next slide, please. So finally, in terms of next steps, staff will continue consulting on the preliminary growth scenarios to identify a preferred scenario. And this work will provide a key input into the region's lands needs assessment, which will be released later this summer or early fall. And staff will also continue to evaluate the urban expansion areas I described earlier, as well as the individual expansion requests to determine the most appropriate locations for growth. And this process will culminate in a recommended draft ROP amendment anticipated later this year. And starting this fall, staff will also begin work on the non-growth related component of the ROP review. And this work will include a review of several policies related to the environment, climate change, mineral aggregate resources, source water protection, and other policies. That concludes my presentation, Mr. Chairman, and staff would be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Sean and Jamie. And before we go any further, I did forget to ask if there are any declarations of pecuniary interest. And I think there is. Councillor Jowett.
Thank you. As presented earlier today, I sent an email to all of regional staff and senior leadership team and council members that I am somebody who is going to be someone who's going to be recognized as a direct pecuniary interest because of the property I own that was engaged in the land conversion initiated by the provincial government. I hope that's enough information. I have sent it into staff as well.
Yeah, I think we all received that. Thanks, Councillor Jowett. Okay, so we'll have a few questions from council, but this is primarily intended for public input. We have people who are going to be delegating. Right now I have 2 speakers who want to ask questions of clarification. Councillor Jaworski.
Thank you very much. Through the chair to, I think to Jamie regarding the presentation on things like jobs per hectare. And as you know, certainly sprawl is the enemy of climate change and greenhouse gases. There will come a day we'll all have EVs and that, but not yet today. And my question is about jobs per hectare. So a hectare is pretty big. So, you know, it's over 100,000 square feet. And I think you said 65 jobs per hectare. So you just do the quick math on that. That works out to like, you know, 1,700 square feet for each and every job. And like it just, the math doesn't seem to work out to me. So if you had an office tower, that would certainly well eclipse that number. And I realize it has to take into account infrastructure around it, but could you shed light on that? Like the number 65 offhand seems actually quite low.
Yes, through you, Mr. Chair. It's a great question. So there's sort of two components of the density. There's the employment density in the employment areas, which is actually 35 jobs per hectare in the employment areas. And then in community areas, we have a combined density ranging from a minimum of 60 in the base case to a higher density of 65 people in jobs per hectare. We haven't explicitly identified the density of the community area jobs in that calculation. They tend to be higher because, as you pointed out, jobs related to office and even some retail can be fairly dense. We work at home only adds to the overall density. It can be included in that calculation, but doesn't require additional land. But when it comes to the employment area densities, so the industrial type buildings, the densities are quite low. When we look at the trends that we've been experiencing, as I mentioned, over the last decade or so, average densities have been declining because of that influence of land extensive uses, primarily related to warehousing, distribution, transportation. So when we look at areas where in the region where that kind of demand is been predominant, it's having a downward impact. There is not as much upward impact to offset that. There is some office development occurring in employment areas, but the growth plan is directing that the majority of major office development is provided in downtown areas, so urban growth centers, as well as other strategic growth areas like major transit station areas. So we do feel that it's important to strive to achieve a slightly higher density over the long term, and we think it's reasonable that over the long term, as land values increase and as we increasingly utilize existing employment areas, we will see some upward movement in that density, but we don't expect to see a steady or a sharp increase in the density.
Thank you very much. Now regarding what I'm going to call hidden intensification. So a number of large employers here have actually shed office buildings, but not shed jobs. So they're just intensifying, they're hoteling. So we actually have, I don't want to say a surplus of office buildings, but certainly it has enabled more employment, perhaps 2x. I'm just wondering how that might factor in going forward. There's obviously a brand new phenomenon happening during pandemic, but we might think that this phenomenon will continue, and there's an automatic intensification caused by the pandemic with existing, in particular, office towers?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's something obviously we've been trying to follow fairly routinely, as well as other impacts from COVID. I would expect that we will see increased office intensification again through higher land values, and as well as greater utilization through office sharing and more hybrid type office environments. I think it's important to recognize, though, that the at-home employment that we're experiencing now, most of that's still being captured as, and will be captured as, usual place of work type employment. So even though you may be a hybrid worker, you're still included as a usual place of work type employee. But I think it's fair to say that there's upward pressure on the overall densities that we would expect to experience in the office sector over time. And that's something that we have been noticing even prior to COVID. So we are trying to take a bit of a longer term viewpoint when it comes to all of these trends. So looking at how things were evolving prior to COVID, during COVID, and then after COVID. And I would agree with you that we would expect to see densities continuing to move upward in the office sector.
Thank you, Jamie. No more questions.
Okay, Councillor Shantz, you took your hand down?
And my question was very similar to Dave's,
Okay.
just about modeling, but I would maybe just ask, so is there room for changes to those numbers and to that density? You know, if we're looking at some changes with work from home, or is that pretty well carved in stone?
Again, through you, Mr. Chair, I would say that most of the impact that we would expect to be seeing on densities, we would likely expect to see within the community areas. This is as a result of some of the discussion we just had on the office environment. When it comes to employment areas, where the density is quite low at 35 jobs per hectare, overall, I don't see a major influence in densities, upward densities from COVID or over the long term. Again, maybe some longer term upward pressure because of higher land values. But even when you look at densities in areas of the GTA where land values are much, much higher than they are in Waterloo, densities are still quite low, because ultimately employers are not, and businesses are not necessarily concerned with the metrics that planners use when planning employment areas. They're really trying to maximize the space and utilization of the building in terms of how much they can store and operate within that building, not necessarily the amount of people. When it comes to COVID and work at home, again, most of those work at home employees that we are seeing now are not truly work at home. They're going to be back either in the industrial space, or some of them may be working in a more of a hybrid type manner, but would still be included in that overall density. So when we do a survey to figure out what the densities are now or in 5 years, the work at home numbers are not likely going to impact that overall density. And the last thing I would say is that, if anything, COVID's having probably even more of a downward impact on densities, because we're seeing more pressure for e-commerce and less emphasis on traditional bricks and mortar retail, which is just putting more emphasis on logistics, warehousing, and local fulfillment centers to accommodate the retail needs.
Okay, I'd like to have a discussion about that, but I'm going to leave it at that for now.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Babanovic?
Thank you very much, and thanks for the report. Two questions. On one of the slides, you were referencing various types of units, and then you referenced 1-bedroom units and then 2+ bedroom units. And one of the things that increasingly we're hearing as we talk about development is, particularly as we talk about intensification, is the lack of construction of homes that are, or units that are more than 2 bedrooms in size, in order to accommodate families. Because we know that, whether we're talking urban centers, urban subdivisions, rural subdivisions, the success of them, really relies on not being able to just attract, single adults, but in fact, a diversity of family types and sizes. And so I'm just wondering, is there a tool here that we can use as part of the ROP, and not just at our local order of government, to in fact try to ensure that there's more of that type of housing being constructed?
Yes, through you, Mr. Chair. It's a fascinating question for me. I look at this obviously in a lot of detail through the lens of the LNA methodology, and looking at this all over the Greater Golden Horseshoe. And so it's really important to recognize that there's a need to align the population that we're projecting, and that population by age structure, to the types of housing that age structure will require. So that's essentially the household formation that is associated with that population. So Waterloo is unique in the sense that it has a number of, I guess I would say, broad demographic groups. looking at, so starting with the younger age groups associated with students, young urban professionals, and non-permanent residents, typically in that 19 to 29 age group. Then you have a very broad and healthy and growing category of young families, and then also empty nesters and seniors. And so there's a need to provide a broad range of housing across all those categories. One of the things that we've been trying to emphasize in the work is the need to balance this ultimate objective of providing a broad mix of housing across all ages and income groups, housing that is ultimately affordable, but also housing that can accommodate a broad range of demographic groups, including families. And so we feel that the medium density category is one particularly strong housing market product that we would suggest should continue to be looked at, both in the built-up area and in the designated greenfield area. There's opportunities to accommodate medium density, not only within certain strategic growth areas, but also outside of strategic growth areas through more gentle intensification. So this is often referred to as the missing middle component that you may have heard of. And
Absolutely.
so this is definitely a focus that we would say should be emphasized in the ultimate preferred scenario to try to ultimately provide the greatest supply and ultimately demand for medium density. There are some opportunities for larger apartment units, but I would agree that as you get into the larger units, the price point of those units becomes more prohibitive to lower and middle income families, which is also something we need to be mindful of.
Right. No, absolutely. And that actually is a nice segue into my next question, Jamie, which is the issue of housing affordability. There isn't a day that goes by that I don't get questions or comments from residents in the community, or others where we're discussing the issues and the impacts on affordability, how that plays out in terms of the role that we play as a region in terms of affordable housing, and that full spectrum from the shelter system through to affordable home ownership. And specifically, I guess, as we look at this report and the increased pressure on all orders of government to address the issue of affordability, what are the tools that regional council has specifically in relation to the regional official plan to positively influence affordability going forward?
I think I'm going to let Michelle, Sergi open up with comments on that, and I can always follow up with some additional points if needed.
Michelle?
Thank you.
We're going to try it through my phone. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay.
Sounds okay,
So,
Michelle.
perfect. So I apologize for that through the chair. So affordability is a really challenging matter. There are a lot of things going on that influence what's going on from an affordability perspective here in the region that are beyond our control. So there's dynamics that are happening in the GTHA that are influencing us. So it's not just a local problem, it's very complex, but there are some things that we can do locally with respect to the regional official plan. So we are planning for an affordability target. We are trying to pave the way for inclusionary zoning associated with the area municipalities. So we're looking at our condo conversion policies. So there's some specific things that we can do that can lay some of the groundwork and be part of the solution towards getting us towards affordability. But like I said, it's a very complex problem. And so it will take planning, as well as a lot of other sort of programs and concerted effort in order to help move the mark with respect to affordability. Jamie, I don't know if you had anything to add to that.
I just would add that one of the factors to also keep in mind when we're looking at historical trends in housing by type, structure type, and then going forward is the issue of tenure. And so ownership versus rental housing. And that's not a specific requirement that comes out of the LNA, but it is something that we've looked at and are continuing to look at with the region more as background to help inform the housing mix. And so more work will need to be done on affordability, but just wanted to point out that when I look around most municipalities in the Greater Golden Horseshoe, I see a significant increase in the demand for rental housing moving forward because of that demand from the aging population, because of upward prices on pressure on housing prices, and also in your case, you have a significant demand from a younger population age group with students and young urban professionals, as I mentioned. A large percentage of that rental housing will be in the form of high density housing. So not getting into the affordability question maybe head on, but I just want to also make sure that we are connecting the dots, so to speak, with respect to housing by structure type and housing by tenure when we're looking at mix, because that has a strong influence in affecting both the type of housing we're delivering and the price of housing or the cost of housing.
Okay, thank you to both of you for that answer. And I think both of these areas, both the missing middle and affordability, is certainly something that I think we're going to need to keep top of mind as we work through this process.
Okay, I did have one question myself, and then we'll get to the delegations, or one comment. So it was interesting in the presentation, no matter what the assumptions were for jobs per hectare, or units per hectare, or the intensification of industrial space or industrial uses, when you worked those out to the land requirements, there was some major variations for every 5% that you changed the assumption in the various scenarios. So are any of these scenarios prescribed in the provincial standards, or are these assumptions ones that we can create ourselves?
Through to you, Mr. Chair. So it's important to recognize that the growth plan does set minimum targets for greenfield density and intensification. So in your case, the minimum target is 50% intensification from the time the plan's approved to 2051. And for the greenfield density target, it's 50 people and jobs per hectare, looking at the entire amount of greenfield land designated, 251. So that's your minimum target. As I mentioned in the slide or in the presentation, that you're already exceeding that minimum target when it comes to greenfield density at 54 people and jobs per hectare. So we can achieve 50 people and jobs per hectare quite easily without really any high density development, as we're already showing through the existing base data in the greenfield area. So we do feel that the minimum requirement of 50 people and jobs per hectare is quite low. It's also important to note that the province, in their update of the growth plan in 2017, and then ultimately when they amended it in 2020, they actually, in 2017, they removed employment areas from that density calculation. So the calculation used to include employment areas, which are very low in terms of density. Now they're just looking at the community area on its own, and employment areas have their own established densities that you have to establish. So you are required to meet those minimums, but you are able to go higher based on what you feel is a sound, assumption to make, balancing market objectives and ultimately policy objectives that you're trying to strive for in your official plan.
Okay. And the other question I had, and maybe this is to Michelle or to Brenna or John, will we at some point in time, will council at some point in time get comparisons, all these various assumptions, 50%, 55%, 60, 65, 15% industrial intensification. Will we get comparative data from other regional municipalities, what their official plans are doing, if they've been reviewed recently, to see whether, we are being under aggressive or over aggressive?
So through the chair, we can provide that information to you. Regional Planning Commissioners has asked their long-range planning group to do just that, to go out and to survey all of the upper tier and single-tier municipalities that are currently going through their reviews to understand what scenarios they're testing. So that is information that we can provide.
Okay, thank you. All right, so we'll go to delegations now. I'll just note that Councillor Clark has joined us, and Councillor Lawrence has been trying to get in, but he is having technical difficulties, I understand. Okay, so we will go to the delegations. I'll just note before we, I don't think we have to say all this, but just in case, to the delegations, any of the following things will result in immediate removal from the meeting, not like that's likely to happen. Interrupting councillors, staff, or other delegations, derogatory statements, turning your camera on at inappropriate times, or any kind of hate speech or defamatory comment. So we'll go to our first delegation, and that's Kai Reimer-Watts from the 50 by 30 Waterloo Region Organization. Kai, you with us? Saw your name previously.
Yes, I am.
There you are.
Is the audio working okay?
It is, Kai, yes.
Okay, thank you. I'll just share my screen here, and I'll keep my comments brief. Thank you, Council, for having me, and I am here to represent the 50 by 30 Waterloo Region group, which is a grassroots network. Many of you have already heard from us. We've had delegations to councils recently to pass a motion in support of a science-based climate target for 2030 of 50% reduction in emissions by 2030. And so far that's been passed in Waterloo, Cambridge, Wellesley, and Woolwich, with others soon to come. And so our message is simple, and I'm imagining this is not a surprise to any of you, that our future development really needs to align with climate science. And so I very much appreciated in the staff presentation seeing the emphasis on a climate change lens to all future development, which we know is critical, as development as usual will continue to worsen emissions. And so there's a recognition that I'm glad to see Regional Council has as well, that there needs to be a shift in approach to development if we are actually going to move rapidly towards a net zero community. And so this, I won't go into the science too much. I believe that's been shared with most or all of you by email, but the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has made clear that we really do need to cut emissions fast on a global basis. And here in Waterloo Region, we can really take advantage of this reality and view it as an opportunity to densify, which I did appreciate seeing emphasis on, and to innovate climate solutions that also center equity. And so, of course, I appreciated the comments around affordability in our future development planning as well. And so I suppose our main emphasis is that all growth scenarios consider their emissions reduction potential, center equity, innovation, considerations of adapting to climate impacts, which we know are coming our way, and some amount of accountability to reduce emissions, because at the end of the day, the decisions that we make around growth now will have quite a significant impact on our short and long-term emissions trajectories. So the decisions we make around infrastructure, etc. So I did also want to emphasize 50 by 30's support for the Transform Waterloo Region Climate Action Strategy. And we have been supportive of that strategy at all council delegations that we've participated in so far. And I hope that this strategy can be viewed as kind of not just another strategy but really as core for guiding that climate change lens, in addition to that support for science-based targets. And so one of our points of emphasis has been the need for advocacy to higher levels of government, including the province and federal government, recognizing that for our region, especially with the pressures of population growth and other pressures on the region to achieve these deep emissions reduction cuts, we're going to need additional support in addition to our own local capacity. So I hope that that Regional Council considers taking an active role in advocacy to higher levels of government as well, so that we can stay on the mark with climate science for a safe climate future for all of us. Thank you very much.
And 5 minutes is up. Very good, Kai. Any questions to the delegation? Seeing none, we'll go to the next delegation then. Thanks, Kai. We'll see you next week, I guess.
We'll see you then. Thank you.
Robyn Brown.
Hello. Can everyone hear me okay?
We can, Robyn, yes.
Wonderful. Good evening, Regional Chair, members of Regional Council and staff. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. My name is Robyn Brown. I'm a Director and Senior Practice Lead at IBI Group in the Real Estate, Economics, and Planning Group. I'm a land use planner and professional land economist, and I participate in growth management exercises across the Greater Golden Horseshoe. I provided input into the growth management components of the latest growth plan and the new land needs methodology as a member of the province's technical working group. IBI Group was retained in 2020 by Schlegel Urban Developments to monitor and participate in the region of Waterloo's Municipal Comprehensive Review, along with SGL Planning and GHD. IBI and the consultant team has contributed to several previous submissions to the region regarding the background work, technical work, and that supports the Regional Municipal Comprehensive Review released last year and early this year. These submissions outlined a number of issues and concerns that our team had with the background technical work, along with questions regarding assumptions and technical details related to the growth management work completed to date. Following those submissions, the region of Waterloo released for consideration the preliminary growth strategies, growth scenarios, and evaluation criteria to assess land need to 2051. IBI Group and our client understand the purpose of this meeting is to release these documents for public consultation. However, we'd like to take this opportunity to reiterate some of our concerns from our previous submissions and bring to attention some new concerns we have after reviewing this report. Number one, the provincial land needs methodology requires that a market-based approach is employed to determine housing need and that a housing forecast by dwelling type is completed to assess community land needs. IBI Group does not believe that housing mix has been appropriately addressed in these growth scenarios, as insufficient detail on housing type and persons per unit has been provided. This is a requirement mandated by provincial policy. Two, given the housing mix by type is not provided, IBI Group cannot weigh in on whether this analysis applies a market-based approach when assessing community area land need. This is a requirement. If sufficient land is not made available to accommodate market demand, this may negatively impact the future of housing choice and affordability in the region if demand outpaces supply. Three, it is unclear whether the region's intention to assume that each growth scenario established will have to accommodate the same mix of housing and non-residential space. We expect that the housing mix would shift for each growth scenario as the intensification and greenfield density targets increase incrementally for each scenario. A shift from ground-related units to apartments may negatively impact the ability of the region to meet the 2051 population targets in Schedule 3 of the growth plan. To ensure the region will allocate sufficient land to accommodate projected growth, we request the region provides the housing forecast by dwelling type and area, dwelling type for each of the growth scenario. I know that the presentation from Jamie, which I appreciated, provided a bit more detail, but we still think there's a lot more that we should know about how these were established. This will allow transparency and allow us to understand the assumptions used to create the community land need. The evaluation criteria as currently presented does not provide enough details regarding how the evaluation criteria will be applied to each growth scenario or potential expansion, and does not provide an adequate framework to differentiate each of the scenarios. For example, certain themes as agricultural and mineral aggregate resources have 8 evaluation criteria, whereas other categories have fewer. This would imply that certain themes or criteria are weighted more heavily than others. We would like to understand whether the region intends to weight certain themes and criteria differently to determine a total score, and how the growth scenarios and expansion areas will be compared to each other and ranked. IBI Group recommends the region establish a scoring and weighting framework for the different themes and evaluation criteria to rank the relative importance of each parameter being assessed. This will allow for a transparent approach. Finally, IBI Group would appreciate a follow-up from staff on our previous submissions, including SGL's submission on the most recent release, which included other planning and technical hydrogeology matters. We're happy to meet to discuss the technical details and assumptions which underpin the scenarios to ensure there's full transparency in this exercise. I want to thank you for your time. IBI Group, Schlegel Urban Developments, and the other consulting team look forward to participating in the next round of consultation and hearing any feedback you may have. I'm happy to answer any questions of council.
Okay, thanks, Robyn. Any questions to Ms. Brown? Okay, thanks very much, Robyn. And I would direct staff to get back to you on those questions that you've asked, and hopefully those discussions will be ongoing as we get to the next iteration. Okay, the next delegation is Paul Britton. Oh, sorry. I think we had a question. Councillor Harris, did you have a question?
I did, just of Robyn, if you don't mind. Sorry, if she's still able to, is she still there, Councillor Galloway?
Yes, Robyn's here, yes.
I just wanted to ask, you did mention the correspondence with staff, and I know they've been doing obviously great work on this file, but I'm just wondering if you feel as a consultant that you've had open dialogue in discussing some of these details with staff, and perhaps staff, I guess maybe I'll ask my second question then after you answer the first one. So maybe you just want to clarify that.
No, I would definitely say that staff has had several meetings with us, and I would definitely not fault them. However, we haven't received any formal responses to some of our original questions, and I understand some of them are technical in nature. I think our concern is particularly around this latest round of report, which didn't seem to have a lot. And I apologize, I so said through you, Chair.
Yeah, I never do it either, so or always forget. But I don't know, staff, Michelle, maybe if you just want to respond to that, because I'm sure perhaps there's others that'll come forward with some similar concerns as to what the plan would be to address, the folks that have sent in correspondence.
Through the chair. So this is the beginning of the conversation with respect to growth scenarios. So the information, the detailed information is being released over the next little while. We do have a series of webinars coming up at the end of the month. So I think with respect to providing the information, it will be coming out to everyone in response to the individual inquiries that we've had, as well as more globally to everyone. So that is the plan moving forward. So I hope that provides some assistance.
Great, thank you.
Okay,
thank you, Councillor Galloway.
Thank you, Robyn, again. We'll now go on to Paul Britton. Paul?
Can you hear me, Chair Galloway?
We can, Paul, yes.
Great. Thank you, Chair and committee, council, staff. My name is Paul Britton, and I'm appearing on behalf of Activa Holdings, Inc., and the geographic location of their lands is in Southwest Kitchener. So my comments will be very high level, some similar themes as Robyn's presentation. Also to build upon and round out, I guess, Jamie's presentation from a contextual point of view. So really 3 components to the presentation. One is context. The other is available information. And then the third, just generally in terms of scenario, and then what we think our next steps will be in terms of ongoing consultation with staff. So just in terms of context, the growth plan, there was a question surrounding affordability. The growth plan recognizes the direct link between housing supply and housing affordability. And in terms of market-based affordability, just generally speaking, my definition of affordability is housing that people want and need at prices that they can afford. And I think in terms of this local context, everyone is aware that across the board, doesn't matter what housing type people are wanting to buy, the prices are going through the roof. And it would be my submission that there's a direct link there to the available supply. And as most of you know, I do considerable work in Waterloo region. We've been working with the Altus Group in terms of land budget, and we've done considerable inventory analysis. And the problem that we're facing in Waterloo region is the consumption of inventory is outpacing the replacement supply. So consumption is exceeding supply and the demand is increasing. And I think that's the reality of the local situation. So in terms of the growth plan itself, it addresses this directly by providing direction to Jamie and the balance of regional staff who are reporting to you to address the challenge by planning for a range of unit types and providing for an adequate supply of land, not just for housing, but for employment. So the question is, what is the appropriate range of housing and how is that to be determined? The determination is to be made in the context of the land budget methodology that is prescribed by the province. And in terms of that land budget methodology, staff have emphasized on page 2 of the report two important variables, and that's density and intensification. And in the scenarios in response to Mayor Verbanovic's question, you are required to achieve the minimum density, minimum intensification targets, and each scenario presented to a greater or lesser extent exceeds those minimums. So as a general rule of thumb, recognizing the available inventory, the higher the rate of intensification and the higher the densities, the greater the proportion of high density apartments that will be provided and the lower amount of ground related housing such as townhomes, in my opinion, stacked towns, singles and semis. So then the question really comes down to how many people from a market perspective over time want to live in apartments. So Jamie did mention the young population that we have, university students. But what I think is important to note is non-resident students are not included within the growth forecast of the growth plan and are to be provided for separately. So caution has to be taken with respect to incorporating or using the student demand for housing to justify or otherwise rationalize a higher rate of apartment construction within Waterloo region. The needs of the balance of the population ought to be properly considered and evaluated. In terms of the land budget methodology, I think as Robyn has noted, it requires an assessment of market need, market demand, an evaluation of the existing composition of housing, and an evaluation of the future need and demand for housing broken down by housing type, having regard to propensity and taking into consideration market demand, with a policy-based adjustment necessary to achieve those minimum intensification and density targets. So in terms of
I have to
where
ask
we're
you
at,
to wrap up, Paul, if you could, please.
yes, I would agree with Robyn that in terms of the information that's available in the staff report, it's inadequate to come to an objective conclusion and provide reasonable input to the process. We brought this to staff's attention, so as far as our next steps, our intention is to meet with staff to review the information such that we can provide meaningful and objective input to the land budget when it becomes available. So thank you for listening, and I will be available for any questions.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Any questions to Mr. Britton? Councillor Harris.
Thank you, Chair. I do have my camera off. I'm having a bit of a Wi-Fi issue, but you and I have had a chance to speak at length in the past. You did reference the fact that, and we all know this locally right now, the housing market is going through the roof, obviously. More demand than supply. I don't know if you can speak to kind of, I guess, stakeholders assessment that you work with in terms of, obviously we have to forecast to 2051, but, where are we at today with the previous, the numbers and the supply and versus demand? I mean, are we already in a hole trying to continue to add supply? I mean, perhaps you can speak to that if you don't mind.
Yes, certainly. I think we are in a hole with respect to land supply. According to our analysis, the last go around at a 2031 population horizon year, there was a shortage of land at that time. Now we're at a 2051 planning horizon with an increased amount of growth to be accommodated. And so I would suggest to council that the supply side is becoming in a sort of a cumulative deficit position. And the issue I would have is it's great to look at what's happened in the past, the recent 5 to 10 years, but it would be my submission in large part that's as a result of a shortage of ground-related housing in Waterloo region. And I can speak to that with considerable authority because I've done extensive analysis in terms of the available inventory. And, you don't really have to look any further than the city of Waterloo, for example, which is obviously growing up because it's constrained with respect to its ability to expand out. So in terms of what's available as far as ground-related housing in Waterloo, it's there's a significant shortfall relative to demand, and that's a directly reflected in terms of the price of housing in Waterloo.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
We'll move on now to the next delegation, and that's Sasa Filipovic from Sunset Hills Estates in Woolwich. Sasa, you with us?
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Start my video. Sorry, this is the first time I'm doing a Zoom meeting.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
My name is Sasha. I'm one of the owners of Sunset Hills Estates Corporation. I don't have any visual presentations.
That's fine.
I just wanted to take a couple of minutes and point out and explain who we are and to answer any questions if there is regarding our application. I know we're a small little part of this, okay? This is a grand scheme, and I started wondering, should I even do the presentation? Because we're a small developer. We develop a residential subdivision in Maryhill, Ontario. The subdivision is located at the end of Homestead Drive and Zingervilla Place in Maryhill. We did a whole infrastructure for the subdivision, underground services, roads, sidewalks, parklands, upgraded the pumping station for our development. And to get our development approved, we had to upgrade the streets leading to the subdivision and create an additional road on the north side of our subdivision. Basically, when we created this road, it actually created a section of the road that's bordering the rural area and the farmland. This section of the road is fully serviced, including sidewalks, and can support the additional 4 lots that we applied for. These lots are indicated on your page 17 of your report. It's a small little section that's highlighted in blue. As of this day, this oh geez, where did I go now? I lost my track of thought. like this road is fully serviced. And as of now, the township is responsible for cleaning the sidewalks, maintenance of the boulevards, and this area. With approval of these lots to be added to the rural part of town, we would utilize this section of the road and eliminate the need for the township to maintain it. In addition, this approval would generate short-term and long-term revenue to township in a form of building permits and property taxes without spending any money for the infrastructure. With all the services in place, soil studies completed, and the area being already graded to accommodate building without removing or adding any material, these lots only need a house plans and permits and are permit ready for construction. And this area is not getting farmed, and it's not affecting any of the prime farmland if we add these 4 lots to the rural area. In my opinion, this would kind of improve the landscape of this section of the road, and I think that everybody could benefit out of it. I mean, we would benefit, and I think the township would benefit out of it. I know there's no decisions to be made during this, and I know you guys are dealing with a bigger picture, but to us, this would be kind of a pretty important part to be reviewed, and your input and your consideration would be appreciated. And that's pretty much it. If anybody has any questions, I'm glad to answer it.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Filipovic. Any questions to the delegation? Okay, seeing that, I just wanted to ask staff, is Mr. Filipovic's application or consideration, is this an expansion of the urban boundary or the countryside line? Michelle? Or?
Right. I almost forgot to use my phone. So through the chair. So I believe the area that we're talking about is part of the rural settlement area. So I'm looking for John to nod. Yes, John's nodding. So it's not part of an urban boundary or township urban area expansion. It's related to the rural settlement areas. Discussions related to the rural settlement areas will be ongoing throughout the summer and are on a bit of a separate track from the discussions that we're having today.
Okay.
But we certainly do have the information related to Maryhill.
Right, okay. So Mr. Filipovic, staff will be getting in touch with you to have further discussions on your request.
Thank you, everybody.
Okay, thank you. The next delegation is Greg Romanick. Greg, there he is.
Hi,
Greg.
good evening. Can you hear me okay?
We can, Greg, yes.
Good. Thank you. Good evening, Chair Galloway, Chair Redmond, members of the Planning and Works Committee, staff, and those listening. My name is Greg Romanick. I'm a planner with Stantec Consulting Limited. I'm here this evening on behalf of my client, Mr. Ron Stroh, the owner of Stroh-West Ontario, Inc., which owns 16.68 hectares, or approximately 41 acres of land, immediately abutting the west boundary of the existing village of Wellesley. I'm going to share my screen with you, if I might. Are you able to see my screen with the map showing the subject lands outlined in red?
Yes, we can, Greg, yes.
Great. So over the past several years through the rationalization of land process, 10.73 hectares or approximately 26.5 acres of my client's lands, or approximately 2/3 of his holdings, were brought into the urban area for the Wellesley urban area through that process. We've since gone through pre-consultation, and we are currently working through studies and packaging up a complete application to bring forward a residential plan of subdivision for these lands outlined in the heavy earth or contiguous red line. As part of the this regional official plan process, we have submitted a written request to have the remaining portion of the lands, which are to the north, shown in the dashed red line. This is approximately 5.6 hectares or just under 15 acres of land, also brought into the Wellesley urban area. In our letter of submission, we identify a number of important planning reasons why we believe the balance of these stroll lands would be an ideal choice and should be brought into the Wellesley urban area. In fact, many, if not all, of the reasons we identify would very much align with the evaluation criteria in attachments A and D in the staff report. We do understand that this evening the report before you is somewhat more about setting up the system for looking at growth and identifying growth, choosing and ultimately choosing a growth scenario. Subsequently, at a later date, in a subsequent process, we also understand that that growth will be allocated and geographically identified as to where it will be accommodated. We generally agree at this time and support the evaluation criteria with respect to choosing a growth scenario and also on how and where to assign growth. I think there were some points made earlier about the fact that, and generally details do count. And I think as the process unfolds, we are interested to watch and see the information unfold. And also when evaluation criteria are used, it is somewhat of an art, not a science, and the application of those evaluation criteria and the way they're used, it's a challenge, and it warrants some scrutiny and participation in our minds, anyways. One key point we did want to make that in this regional context, in choosing the preferred growth scenario, we do believe that the amount of growth and the distribution of that growth should occur throughout the entire region, in all of the local municipalities within the region. We believe that doing this would align with the overall intent of the actual criteria set out in attachment A, but also, and more fundamentally, we think that by doing so, we would be providing much more choice and options for people living throughout the region and in all of the region's communities, and would also enhance and help support all of those communities. My last point is that the process considering how to allocate growth, which is going to happen subsequently, we do believe and hope that it will continue to be an open consultative process, such as it's been to date. And we would also say that we very much support the idea that decisions about how and where to allocate growth should be made on the basis of good planning principles. Thanks very much, Mr. Chair. We do look forward to continued involvement in this process. Thank you. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay, thanks very much, Greg. Any questions to Mr. Romanick? Okay, seeing none, thanks very much, Greg. We'll move on then to the next delegation. That's Brandon Flewwelling from Kitchener. Brandon, there you are.
Yes, good evening, Mr. Chair, members of Regional Council. My name is Brandon Flewwelling, and I'm a planner with GSP Group in Kitchener. I'm here this evening to briefly speak to 3 individual properties for which I've submitted letters on behalf of my clients. Firstly, on behalf of Cachet Development Partners, Inc., I've submitted a letter for their properties located in the township of Wilmot at 1265 and 1299 Waterloo Street, New Hamburg. This letter is indicated at number 31 in attachment B to the regional staff report, and is also shown, the property is also shown on the Baden and New Hamburg map on page 26 of the report. The subject land are within the countryside line and identified, and within the identified candidate urban expansion area as shown in the presentation earlier this evening. These properties represent a logical location for future urban expansion between New Hamburg and Baden. I simply want to take some time on behalf of Cachet this evening to confirm that we are engaged in this process and look forward to continued dialogue with regional and township staff and the request for and future recommendations as it relates to this property. Secondly, I'm here on behalf of Activa Holdings Inc. and 1589805 Ontario Inc. We have submitted a letter on their behalf for property owned within the township of North Dumfries, but situated along the southeast municipal limits of the city of Cambridge and the new second phase of the South Boundary Road. This property is shown on page 21 of the staff report and is identified as rural on the east side of Branchton Road, north of the countryside line. This property as well is identified as within the candidate urban expansion area and is adjacent to a proposed draft plan of subdivision by Activa. The draft plan of subdivision is within the designated greenfield area of the city of Cambridge. The parcel I'm speaking of tonight is identified in the Township of North Dumfries official plan with a special policy area recognition, identifying this land for priority consideration for inclusion within the urban area boundary and designated greenfield area at the next municipal comprehensive review. I'd withheld submitting a letter on this property in light of the priority consideration policies in the Township official plan. However, I want to take the opportunity to present that to this council and seek the opportunity to further discuss this property specifically with the appropriate staff. And thirdly and lastly, I'm here to speak on behalf of Hilda Shirey and family, who own property in North Cambridge near the intersection of Fairway Road and Fountain Street. The Shirey family lands are located within the prime agricultural area shown on the Breslau North Cambridge map on page 15 of the staff report, but also within the candidate urban expansion area as shown in tonight's presentation. The Shirey lands were previously a contiguous farm parcel, but were ultimately bisected by the extension of the Fairway Road. And these lands are located within the approved but under appeal ROPA 2 lands in the city of Cambridge. The ROPA 2 appeal, or the ROPA 2 approval as approved by regional council but under appeal, identified approximately 24 hectares of the Shirey land to be designated as urban designated greenfield area and approximately 8 hectares to be designated as primary industrial strategic reserve. In addition, ROPA 2 had provided a policy which stated that for lands north of the designated priority industrial strategic reserve north of Fairway Road, south of the Grand River, west of Fountain Street, namely the Shirey lands, future consideration will be given to including these lands as part of a potential future airport employment reserve through the next municipal comprehensive review. Again, the Shirey family are party to the ROPA 2 appeal and are supportive of the staff or the approved ROPA 2. And I wanted to submit this letter and provide this presentation to, again, confirm to regional council that the Shirey family is engaged in this process. They're supportive of ROPA 2 being resolved and they're ultimately requesting that all remaining portions of their land be included within this next phase of the regional comprehensive review. Their lands within the would represent a logical location for future urban expansion and provide a well-defined urban limit adjacent to the Fairway Road and Fountain Street intersections. I'll conclude my remarks there, but I did want to bring those 3 properties to specific attention of regional council, and I welcome any questions.
Okay, thanks, Brandon. Any questions to Mr. Flewwelling? Okay, seeing none. Thanks very much, Brandon. The next delegation is Linda Laepple from Wellesley. Linda. There we go.
Yes, hello.
There we are.
Yes, my name is Linda Laepple, but I'm not from Wellesley. Somehow, I don't know how I got there. I'm from Wilmot. Thank you for allowing me to speak tonight. I am just a farmer. We all need growth, healthy growth, as human, as municipalities, and as a region. We need to grow up, grow mature, and grow wise. In any body, uncontrolled and unplanned growth is called cancer. I'm a farmer, and looking over the regional official plan planning concept, I welcome the identification goals The land planning budgets, on the other hand, come with a lot of questions. There's a budget for housing, green space, employment land, but no budget for land to grow food. Have we forgotten why people settled here in the first place and why native people called it home for thousands of years before us? It was because climate and fresh water allowed to build soil over millions of years, soil that feeds people. Soil and climate so good we find only in a very few places on this planet and very limited in Canada too. The growth plan is based on the assumption that there will be always someone, somewhere out there to grow food to feed the city. We plan that somewhere in the region, in Ontario, Canada, or somewhere in a foreign country will care enough to feed our cities. Will rezoning productive farmland to build a grocery store bring true food security? We are not over the fallouts of the pandemic yet, but some lessons learned should be reflected in the growth plan. It takes about 1 acre to feed one person, 0.4 hectare. Current population of Waterloo region, around 600,000. Where is the acre that feeds you, your children, your grandchildren? 2006 census, Waterloo region had 226,000 acres. In 2016, it was 215,000 acres of farmland. We lost 11,000 acres of growing food land in 10 years. So in 7 generations, there would be not one farm, not 1 acre left if we keep going like this. Looking at Canada's landmass and comparing it with a table set for 24, only one plate would reflect farmable areas, 5%. The area of the small outside rim of the single plate reflects the soil classes as good as we find in Waterloo region. With 95% of Ontario's landmass not able to grow food, there is no opportunity to develop. Therefore, new growth needs to be directed where we no longer can grow any food. Within the region, building housing and employment places on brownfields, exhausted, abandoned, and never rehabilitated agriculture sites, for example. Allow for allotment gardens on unused parcels of land. And outside the region, we need to create partnership with rural municipalities and northern districts on land in areas where food production is very limited or impossible. Design and develop satellite communities there as an option to still grow by protecting farmland here and moving to better food sovereignty and food security. Now, a satellite community could be as small as big as we planned for. It could be inclusive, where multiple generations are encouraged to live close enough to help each other. It would be a self-sustaining eco-village or town with its own renewable energy production, own water and waste system, own food processing, like butcher and baker and so on. It would benefit from shared resources offered by the region, like library services and other online services. The region would benefit by collecting a share of the property taxes. The region of Waterloo could be a leading role model and start a new trend across the country. We need to look outside the box, outside the garden land, and technology and knowledge today allows that in 2021. We just need to be brave enough to pioneer it. We need to ask ourselves, who gave us, our generation, the right to treat this planet the way we do? Who gave us the right to use its resources at a speed as if there is no tomorrow?
Okay, thanks very much, Linda. A very important perspective, one that we don't often get delegations on. We always hear from the developers, but sometimes we do hear from the Federation of Agriculture with some of the same concerns that you have expressed as well. And I think, it's a very important perspective that you have brought to us. I have a couple of questions for you. Councillor Jaworski.
Mine is related to staff, but I did want to thank Linda. I'll wait to see if Councillor Shantz has a question of the delegate or staff.
Councillor Shantz?
Yeah, I just wanted to thank Linda as well for coming and reminding us that agriculture is part of who we are and is very necessary. And you're right. We tend to look at development as all the other pieces, but that's a major part of it. So thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. Any other questions to the delegation? Seeing none, then Councillor Jaworski.
Thank you very much. Through the chair to, I think, Michelle, regarding agriculture. This is sort of the opposite of my one of my original questions regarding the covered sprawl and climate change and that as we sprawl and consume more land, we have to have more infrastructure and more traveling. The opposite is, as we sprawl, we're actually consuming things like farmland. So in the provincial policy, as we do work on the ROP, we certainly look at employment that needs to be considered in the future, and we look at housing that needs to be considered in the future. Where in provincial policy is it for a municipality to look after agriculture? This is an excellent question.
So through the chair, the requirement for agricultural protection or protection of agricultural resources shows up in a couple of provincial planning documents. So it shows up in the growth plan, which is one of a newer edition. It was not included in that previous to 2017. We also get direction from the provincial policy statement that sets out the need to protect agriculture. I would also point out that protecting agriculture and natural resources is sort of a hallmark of regional Waterloo planning. And something that we work very hard to ensure that we do. There is a bit of a trade-off when it comes to talking about growth and talking about the use of agricultural resources. And so you'll note that in the criteria that we're using, there is a recognition of consider agricultural resources as we plan for growth going forward.
Thank you very much, Michelle. Thank you to the chair, and thank you, Linda, for your presentation.
Yeah, and I think we certainly have taken that into consideration in the past. Certainly the protected countryside designation and the countryside line are two tools that we have used to try to protect farmland, and we're somewhat unique with both those provisions in the province. Okay, the next delegation is Myron Steinman. Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry, missed you, Councillor Foxton. Sorry.
Thank you, Chair, and through you to Linda. Linda, when you quoted the number of farms or the farmlands and its decline, did you include aggregate in your farmlands? Because they are classified as farmlands, even though it's aggregate. And if we remove the aggregate, I think the numbers would come down even more.
No, I just looked at 2006 census and 2016. It didn't specify about aggregates.
So it may have been included in that number. I just want council to be aware of that.
Okay.
That with the aggregate is classified as farm. They pay a farm classification. Thank you.
Okay, good point. Then the next delegation is Myron Steinman. Mr. Steinman, saw you there for a moment.
Thank you, Chair Galloway. And can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
And thank you. I'd also like to recognize Regional Chair Redmond. And my comments are largely intuitive. I thought I had registered 5 days ago, but apparently I made a technical mistake. I would ask if someone could warn me when 1 minute is left, because I don't have a time clock in front of me.
Yes, I will do that, Myron.
Thank you. I do appreciate the comments of Mayor Brovanovic with his concern with larger than 2-bedroom units, and his concern about not just type but affordability. My experience with this, like I said, goes back in Waterloo region 40 years, I would say, when I moved here for post-secondary studies. And I hope to live as long as my mother to the end of this planning year, which is, I'll be 90 in 2050. Celebrate her 90th birthday. I did listen carefully to the presentation. I only was able to listen with half a year to the people who made a presentation to the. I heard nothing also about the area that's excuse me, colored peachy orange on the in the original study document, which is Duck is owned rural. And that is what I had wanted to direct my comments to tonight. I understand, there was no comments on what rural meant. To me, rural means farmers and food production, recreational land for more intensified areas. There's a lot of bike lanes and stuff around our region. And aggregate production, which to me means having gravel for our roads and new infrastructure, and also recycling of asphalt, which I see as two contradictory purposes. I have had made these comments before. Well, first of all, I would like to say I live in Ward 9 in the city of Kitchener. And there was no comments at all about the rural areas and what rural meant. And I have made these comments before at a meeting of in Ward 9, but I don't think they were they may not have been recorded. When I was in grade 13, some 40 years ago, we said we were going to have one metropolis from Windsor to Montreal, and that dystopia has not occurred, and I'm glad. Also, the zoning has been all about not creating piecemeal development. But I would say what I had wanted to title this was Alternatives to Rural Single-Family Estates Properties and the Limitation of Zoning as a Planning Tool. That was I had wanted to title this thesis. When I go traveling around Breslau and Maryhill, I come across a lot of estate properties. We don't have piecemeal development, and we don't have single-family homes sprawling like the one person said, like cancer. But we do have these large properties which have large homes.
Myron, it's 1 minute now.
Thank you. Surrounded by lots of land. And my suggestion is that farmers pay the highest taxes here. They pay the municipal taxes, which agricultural land has the lowest charge on, but they pay huge taxes for renting this land from these large estate owners. And I had proposed back in 1980 an alternative to this, which would take up no more land than these large estate properties that have large manicured lawns, and it would take up no more agricultural land than those areas. So in conclusion, these large estate properties are not rural. We are not rural in Waterloo region. They have the lowest tax rate possible by the municipality, but the farmers pay the highest tax rate possible because they pay rental fees to these large property owners, which only have houses. There is no farming structure on these lands. Thank you. That's all I can say.
Okay, thank you very much, Myron. Any questions to Mr. Steinman? Okay, seeing none. Thanks, Myron. That's the last of the registered delegations. I'll ask if there's anybody else on the call that would like to address the committee. They can turn on their camera at this point and identify themselves. Okay, seeing none. That's the end of the delegations then. And as has been indicated earlier, this is really the beginning of the conversation on this part of the official plan review, growth scenarios, evaluation criteria. There will be ongoing discussions, webinar, as Sergi talked about, that I'm sure many people will subscribe to as you get into more of the details of the evaluation criteria. There was some correspondence that was provided to us by a couple of individuals, and I would just make note of those relative to tonight's topic. And is there any other business or questions that people wanted to ask? If not, then we'll entertain a motion to adjourn. Who we got? Councillor Foxton, Councillor Jaworski, and if you would use your yes and no icons to for the motion to adjourn. And that is carried. Thanks, everyone. Thanks to all the delegations for being here. Thanks to staff. And stay tuned. We're on a journey here to get our official plan concluded in the next number of months. Thanks very much.